freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live, this is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. It is the Wednesday edition of Point of View, and as you have heard us say so many times, but especially true today, we're going to cover a lot of different kinds of topics. We will spend a little bit of time talking about the riots, but I also want to talk about some of the things happening in Congress. We will have a little bit later a guest that has been quite the expert on trauma, in case you or someone you know has experienced trauma, how to really address that issue. Next hour, we're going to be talking with a guest that talks about marriage in the second half of life, which I think is a fascinating book as well. Then we're going to come back to some other issues. We have also some very important issues related to vaccines. This coming from the Secretary of Health and Human Services, Robert F. Kennedy. I've posted his piece so you can read it for yourself. And before we end the program today, I want to talk about one of the more significant Supreme Court decisions that have come down. I'll mention it today. We might get into it again on Friday when we have Kelly Shackelford and Jeff Mateer with us, but try to cover a lot of different issues. And as you can probably determine, I don't want to spend too much time today talking about the riots and all the things happening in Los Angeles and other cities. Not that those aren't important. We have certainly given it its due course, but there are many other things happening as well. But one thing I did want to start out with is a piece by Jeff Blehar. To understand some of the things I'm going to read, you got to understand that he actually lives in the Chicagoland area, wrote this for National Review, but it's entitled All Radicalisms Combine into One. And it's an important thing to notice because, as I've already mentioned more than once, but it's worth mentioning every single day, this weekend on June 14th, you have what is called the No Kings Rally, which I think we've now heard there may be about 1,500 different of these anti-American, anti-Trump, anti-ICE kinds of rallies around the country. And this was done deliberately to counteract and to counter-program against what was to be a celebration of the U.S. Army's 250th anniversary on June 14th, which, interesting enough, last night when Governor of the state of California, Gavin Newsom, talked about it, he said, well, this is just to celebrate Trump's birthday. Well, okay, well, maybe his birthday is on that date, but this was about the U.S. Army and a variety of other things. But nevertheless, it's helpful to understand that there are a lot of things coming together over this weekend, and this is why this first article that you might want to read by Jeff Blehar goes into it in some detail. He says, first of all, don't talk to me about ICE activities in Los Angeles being a provocation. People are here illegally. They must go. If they disagree with me, then you fundamentally disagree with American law, and I'm utterly uninterested in your particular position. He says the precise reason that ICE workplace raids are necessary in Southern California is because that is a sanctuary state, and these are sanctuary cities. He says he's also unimpressed with people saying, well, just because it happened in one part of the city doesn't affect another. He said, just imagine in the Chicagoland area if a bunch of protesters shut down the Dan Ryan or started torching Waymos a block from the Daly Center. You can bet people would consider it a citywide affair. And so the point he's making is that they attempt to try to downplay this, to say that it was not violent, that this was only a small area where there were riots, I think doesn't make a great deal of sense. But then he points out that for anyone that was spending any time either on their phone or on their computer, looking at all the various videos that have been posted, or maybe you see some of these on television. He said how often he was seeing Palestinian flags up there with Mexican flags, with pride flags, and a variety of others. And he says someone on Twitter or X described this phenomenon as omni-cause leftism. You're probably going to start hearing that phrase more and more, in which all the groups kind of come together, almost, as he says, into one indistinct blob of nihilism, in which they meet and mix on the streets. And he says this is an old dynamic. If nothing else, this is one of the reasons I wanted to bring it up. We've seen this before, and he reminds us of that in the post, for example, attack on Hamas on Israel. You had pro-Palestinian protest in Chicago, where he's located, but it was also attended by people that were communist workers, socialist workers, others, the team working at that particular time. He says you can go back to even after 9/11, for example, that sometimes there were protests against the Iraq War, and it included people of all sorts of different ideological spectrum. And so in some respects, I think it was just a good illustration of the fact that you are going to see a lot of people there who are maybe there because they're just protesting America, not necessarily even protesting ICE. And this weekend, when we have the No Kings rally, I think you're going to see that more than anything else. He does mention one other thing that I mentioned the other day, but it's mentioning again, and it's worth bringing to the fore, and that is we saw some of these what were called Waymo cars being set afire. They are self-driving cars, if you're not familiar with that. And it turns out that he says some of the Los Angeles rioters were so desperate to show that they were angry and to set something ablaze, the rioters actually ordered the cars to come into their community, these autonomous self-driving cars, so they could set them on fire. I did not know that until I read his piece, but it illustrates again how even some of the things we see that we think maybe are spontaneous, probably a little bit more a good example of done for the show of the cameras, and that's indeed the case. We come back from the break. Let me also get to our second article, which I entitled Medicaid Myth. It is actually written by Nick Steele, and it's just a reminder that one of the things that we have talked about before on this program, and it's worth mentioning again, is that this argument for work for welfare is something that is supposedly a contentious issue right now in the United States Senate. And so Nick Steele, working in this particular area, being from Arkansas, lives in Benton, Arkansas, and also is the vice president of communications of the Foundation for Government Accountability, points out that there are a number of what you might call Arkansas myths related to that particular piece of legislation. And so since we've talked about that with Dr. Merrill Matthews, since my commentary yesterday was on that topic, I thought we would get into that in a little bit more detail as well. And then I'll also just have a brief mention of the fact that now the Secretary of Health and Human Services, and that would be Robert F. Kennedy Jr., has decided in an effort to restore public trust in vaccines, has decided to actually retire the individuals right now that are part of the Advisory Committee for Immunization Practices, so that those that had some kind of conflict of interest would not serve on that particular committee, so that any possible concern, even appearance of collusion or some kind of appearance of some type of compromise would be dealt with. So I want to put that on the table there as well. So we'll get into some of those after the break. But again, if you would like to find out more about some of these articles, you will find them today on the website, pointofview.net.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
For decades, we have heard that the U.S. needs to be more like Europe. But as I've documented in previous commentaries, if we were more like Europe, we would have less liberal abortion policies and fewer transgender surgeries. We can learn some lessons from European countries like Denmark. The Danish government just raised its retirement age to 70 for Danes born in 1971 or later. This was due to a reform passed years ago that ties the retirement age to average life expectancy at age 60. This factors in the reality that people are living longer than when government retirement programs were first instituted. More than 30 years ago, I wrote the book Signs of Warning, Signs of Hope. One of the chapters on the crisis of security documented increasing life expectancy at birth and the increasing percentage of people living over the age of 65. It was inevitable that the U.S. Social Security system would run out of money in the future. A recent Wall Street Journal editorial predicts Social Security will be insolvent in 2033 and predicts the checks will suddenly be 21% smaller. America's politicians won't follow Denmark's lead for 3 reasons. First, later retirement would not be welcomed by people who work in physically demanding professions. I've been a janitor and have dug ditches and worked in a machine shop. I can't imagine how hard it would be to make it to age 70 to retire. Second, no politician wants to touch the third rail of American politics. Third, there's an easier answer: print more dollars. My previous commentaries on the book The Big Print reminds us that politicians will always take the easy way out, even if it means lots of inflation. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free booklet on biblical reliability, go to viewpoints.info/biblical reliability. Viewpoints.info/biblical reliability. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, if you are watching the program and certainly receiving the viewpoints, commentaries I do, you know that yesterday we did the commentary on welfare and work. It was sort of a continuation of a conversation that we've had with Dr. Merrill Matthews, and he wrote a piece in The Hill about the fact that when you look at this requirement in a budget bill that has gone through the House and now is in front of the Senate, it has a provision that would require states to enforce a work requirement for able-bodied individuals on Medicaid between the ages of 19 and 64. Of course, there's all sorts of exceptions for people that are disabled, pregnant, incarcerated, rehabilitation, even if they aren't working and they're at least looking for work or receiving job training, that's the case. But the bottom line is we are seeing a greater and greater number of individuals, able-bodied individuals, receiving all sorts of benefits from the federal government, including Medicaid, which was intended to be a hand up, not a hand out, something to help people in a difficult set of circumstances, but to get them back on their feet, now has become a little bit too easy for individuals to stay on that system. And we'll get into that in just a minute. And the argument that Dr. Matthews made is, look, we have 165 million people, you and me, under the age of 65, although I'm over that age now, who actually are currently having employer-provided health insurance. So they're working for their health insurance. It's a benefit, not a punishment. And this argument that it's somehow a punishment to ask able-bodied individuals to do some work so that they can receive benefits, well, I think that's important. And this piece by Nick Steele reminds us that right now there's this so-called Arkansas myth that's saying that there was a judge that declared the work function in the particular Arkansas law as unconstitutional. First of all, the judge is Judge James Boasberg. If that name sounds familiar, it is. He's the same activist judge who ordered the Trump administration to bring back the Venezuelan gang members, and you might remember all of that. But the bottom line is that they have seen that Medicaid enrollment, even in the state of Arkansas, has exploded and increased by nearly 150% since 2000. It's not that many people have become poor. It's just becoming a lot easier. And even more to the point, the percentage of enrollees who are children, which I think ever since the beginning of the Great Society program was the primary target here, the percentage of enrollees who are children has shrunk. And now almost a third of all the enrollees are people that could be easily identified as able-bodied individuals. So I just wanted you to see that if indeed you are hearing some things about, well, the reason this particular bill is stuck is because we want to put people to work who are poor. Well, no, we want to put people who are able-bodied, who have been on the dole for a long period of time, to at least try to go to work. And they can be looking for work, they can be taking job training, they can do something. And again, when they did have this requirement in Medicaid in the state of Arkansas, just use that example there, they found that the enrollment of able-bodied childless adults fell by nearly 2/3, and it saved, even in the state of Arkansas, $28 million. Again, we are all about providing a hand up for somebody who finds themselves in a difficult situation, but a hand out given in perpetuity is something that doesn't really resonate, and that's why I wanted you to know that this so-called Arkansas myth is indeed a myth. In a few minutes, we're going to talk about some of the myths of trauma, but we'll get to that in due course. He makes also a very good statement that most able-bodied people on Medicaid do not work. And he says their talents, their skills are not being used to build a better future for themselves or to serve their communities. Some of them have been caught in a cycle of dependency that hurts the taxpayer, it hurts Medicaid recipients, and it doesn't make their lives any better, oftentimes makes their lives worse. So if you take this article, put it with my commentary yesterday, or even the article we posted last Friday with Dr. Merrill Matthews, I think you can see this is an issue, and it right now is one of the reasons why the so-called big, beautiful bill is kind of stuck, and it's stuck right at the moment in the United States Senate. So we may even have some action items in that regard in the future, although I think our next action item is going to have to do with the Senate and the fact that all these individuals who could actually serve the government, lots of them in the diplomatic corps, are just languishing over there in the Senate. So we're going to give you some action items. We'll start next Monday to do that, of some very important letters and emails that you can send to your two United States senators. So all that coming up, because we always like to give you an action item. We certainly give you a prayer target. And, of course, we give you a commentary today. And, by the way, my commentary, which I'll get to in just a minute, is on the issue of retirement. But just before I do that, I did mention the fact that we have posted this piece. It goes on for about 3 pages on the issue of vaccines. We don't spend a lot of time talking about this, but Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is the Secretary of Health and Human Services, and he points out in his first paragraph that vaccines have become a divisive issue in American politics. But he says there's one thing all parties can agree on: the U.S. faces a crisis of public trust, whether towards health agencies, towards pharmaceutical companies, or towards vaccines themselves. He is concerned that public confidence is waning. Someone tried to explain this away by blaming misinformation or anti-science attitudes. To do so, however, he says ignores the history of conflicts of interest, persecution of dissidents, lack of curiosity, and skewed science that has plagued the vaccine regulatory apparatus for decades. So he's taken the step, if you're not familiar with this, of actually retiring the 17 current members of what's called ACIP. That stands for Advisory Committee for Immunization Practices. And so these individuals, many of which, by the way, I think I need to insert, were last-minute appointments under the Biden administration, trying to get the rest of their people in there and see if they can make it more difficult for Robert F. Kennedy and, of course, also for Donald Trump. But nevertheless, these are individuals who have actually been in a situation where some of them had conflict of interest in one way or another. And even going all the way back, this is before Donald Trump, this is before Barack Obama, this is when we were talking about George W. Bush. In 2000, the House of Representatives did an investigation of ACIP, which is the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices, and they found that the enforcement of its conflict of interest rules were either non-existent or, at the very best, very weak. And so this is an attempt to say, look, conflict of interest sometimes persists. Some of the members in that particular advisory committee have received substantial funding from pharmaceutical companies, including marketing of those vaccines. And so although this is seen as a very controversial action by Robert F. Kennedy Jr., I think it is the kind of thing we need to have honesty, transparency, and indeed, if you do have a conflict of interest, at least report it so that when you are voting for a particular vaccine or you're voting against a particular action, we might be able to understand that as well. So that is one that I want to put on the table. Those of you that have been concerned about the fact that we don't have as much trust in the medical community, in the pharmaceutical community, this is one of those very controversial actions by Robert F. Kennedy Jr., but I think it is exactly what we needed to do. Let's take a break. Let me just mention real quickly, my commentary today is about the retirement age, and it's not about what's happening in the United States. It's really what happened in Denmark, because the other day Denmark decided to raise its retirement age to age 70. This was actually something due to a reform that was implemented years ago, which tied the retirement age to average life expectancy at age 60, and they're recognizing that people are living longer than when these government retirement programs were first instituted. Now, the difficulty of getting this in this country, well, it's oftentimes referred to as the third rail of American politics. Also, I certainly have sympathy for the fact that individuals that work in physically demanding professions, it is hard enough to think about retirement at age 65, even more difficult at 70. But the reality is nobody really wants to fiddle with Social Security and Medicare and things of that nature. But we really need to, because the reality is people are living longer, and as a result, we need to rethink that. But the sad reality is probably won't happen. But it's a good illustration when people sometimes say, well, we need to be more like Europe. As I point out in my commentary, if we were more like Europe, we'd have less liberal abortion policies, we'd have fewer transgender surgeries, and we would also have older retirement ages as well. So something to learn about. It's one of my commentaries today. You can find it on the website, and we'll be right back.
The Bible tells us not to worry, and yet there is a lot of worrying stuff in our world today. Thankfully, the Bible doesn't stop at telling us not to worry. God gives us a next step. He says we need to pray. But sometimes even knowing what to pray can be difficult, and that is why Point of View has relaunched our Pray for America movement, a series of weekly emails to guide you in prayer for our nation. Each week, you'll receive a brief update about a current issue affecting Americans, along with a written prayer that you can easily share with others. We'll also include a short free resource for you in each email so you can learn more about the issue at hand. Will you commit to pray for America? Go to pointofview.net. Click on the Pray for America banner at the top of the page to subscribe. Again, that's pointofview.net. Click on the Pray for America banner. Let's pray together for God to make a difference in America.
Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
As I mentioned earlier, we're going to talk about the issue of trauma. Trauma is a liar. It claims that all hope is lost and that pain will dictate your life for the rest of your life. You don't really get over trauma, but you get through it, and we wanted to spend some time talking about that. This new book is The Trauma Tree, Going Beyond Survival, Growing Through Wholeness. A very good endorsement from our good friend Carol Kent, who said, if you or someone you know has experienced trauma, this is one of the most important books you can read. And it is written by Lisa Saruga, who is a licensed professional counselor, an EMDR trauma therapist, speaker, and author. She's certified as a legal and ethical specialist by the American School of Counseling Association. First heard about what she is doing through a friend of ours, Christiane Debussine, who I've worked with before as a promoter. And when we heard about this book, we wanted to get her on. And so, Lisa, welcome to Point of View.
Thank you. It's so nice to be here with you today.
Let's, if we can, explain trauma. First of all, it should be obvious that some people know they've been through trauma, but I'm sure you've run into some who only after the fact of say, yeah, I guess that was a traumatic situation. I guess I'm dealing with PTSD and I didn't even know that I was. So in some respects, even giving a good definition is kind of a starting point, isn't it?
It is. And, you know, it's interesting to me as a therapist how many people come into my office and tell me that they've experienced no trauma, and then they go on to tell me these really traumatic incidents in their life. And I think it's a form of self-preservation to kind of deny that that was trauma. So I guess from a definition standpoint, there really are two kinds of trauma. There's big T trauma, and those are the traumatic events that are life-changing and life-threatening. You know, I think of violent crime, severe accidents, loss of a child. And then there's also little t trauma, which maybe it's not life-threatening, but it's still highly disturbing. And often little t trauma is repetitive and chronic. So I think of like child abuse. It might not be life-endangering, but it definitely is going to work on the brain the same way as a big T trauma would.
Wow. Again, about 180 pages published by Kerby'll, 4 chapter sections. There are 16 chapters, but one on survival mode, one on moving through trauma, another avoiding re-traumatization in life beyond trauma. Part of what you already have talked about is the fact that most of us have some kind of coping strengths. You have a chapter on coping strengths we're born with, what you call tap roots, and they have other coping strengths we develop, root systems. But that's part of the reason why sometimes people aren't aware that they've even been through a trauma, because we've learned either through our own experiences or through various kinds of comments being made to us that we do try to cope with that and maybe aren't even aware of what we've actually been through.
Yeah, and a lot of that is denial, too. We do all have some coping mechanisms, even if we're not aware of it. But one of the things that we tend to do to cope is to put that up on a shelf in the back of our mind and think of it as, you know, something unimportant that we're not going to think about again. And that is a coping mechanism. It's maybe not the healthiest coping mechanism, but it is a way to cope.
Sure. You know, one of the things you say is, you hear people say, I don't care what others think about me, but that's really a telltale sign that they really do care, isn't it?
Absolutely. Yeah. That is my first thought when somebody says, I don't really care what anybody else thinks, is that if you didn't care, that wouldn't even be a comment that would come to mind, right? And so, yeah, we all do care what other people think to some extent.
Let's, if we can, talk about how people can use the book, although I would certainly want to get back to that at the end, because you have different sections, And for somebody that's been through a trauma or is at least for the first time identifying it, each one of the chapters then have some questions for reflection, some verses. So this certainly could be something that you could hand to an individual, or right now I suspect there's some people saying, now what was the name of that book again? Because I want to go out and get it or order it. And I might just mention we do have your website on our website here as well, so they can find that information. We also have links to your Facebook page and Twitter or X, as well as information about the book, so you can get it in paperback or Kindle. But a lot of people just want to know, okay, how, if I'm going through this, can I do this? Or is this something I should go through with a counselor? There's just all sorts of questions I suspect people have almost immediately now that we're getting into this issue.
Yeah. In the book, I address strategies that you can use on your own, as well as therapeutic strategies. So I do recommend, if you've experienced a big T trauma or chronic little T trauma, there are various types of therapy in the book that I talk about. But the book itself, I wanted to write it from a real soft perspective, so that somebody who maybe has just experienced trauma and is still in crisis could read the book, and it's not going to take so much bandwidth that it's overwhelming. So you're going to find some educational concepts in there, but I've structured it all around the story of a pear tree.
Yes.
A little pear tree that I had that suffered some damage, and it's just a tree, but it did suffer some trauma. And again, my whole point was to soften it, to not re-traumatize the reader. And so that's where we came up with the terms, tap roots and root systems. That this tree, actually, God provided it with everything that it needed to survive the trauma and to flourish. And He, in the same way, has provided those things for us. And so the book just points out, here's where you might have strengths you can lean into, and here are some things you might want to reject or avoid or prune out of your life.
Yes.
To help get through.
And again, that you do start with the parable of the pear tree, the New Bradford pear, which again suffered a big T trauma. So again, we can, if you use that illustration, I think is helpful. And again, maybe some people might say, okay, well, how do you distinguish between the little T trauma and the big T trauma? Because in some respects, they may be trying to figure out how significant is this and whether I need to go seek help or whether your book might be enough.
I think if you read the book, it will help you define whether or not you need to seek counseling. That's some of the content in the book will help to identify that. In terms of big T and little T trauma, it sounds almost like there's an assumption if it's little T trauma, you don't need therapy. And I want to be really careful to say that trauma, any kind of trauma, lives in a certain part of our brain called the amygdala. And it's an irrational part of the brain that just holds on to the memory and the emotions and the physical response to trauma. And right now, as a therapist, our DSM currently says that you have to experience a big T trauma to be diagnosed with PTSD. And that's something that some of us are really questioning, because chronic little T trauma affects the amygdala exactly like one big T trauma does.
That's a good point.
So, so I wouldn't look at my trauma. A lot of us try to diminish our trauma and then go, well, I don't need counseling because it wasn't that big a deal. But in your brain, it might have been a really big deal.
I would think so.
And if it goes unprocessed, it lives there kind of forever, and you're in danger of that triggering. So, I guess I am of the belief that everybody can benefit from therapy at some point in time.
I would agree. Let's take a break, but when we come back, I want to get into some of the things you were talking about in terms of coping, because some of them, as you say, there's artificial coping, there's denial, there's, of course, substance abuse and those kinds of things. Then it gets into compartmentalization and those kinds of things, and the need for us to have boundaries. So I'd like to maybe have you work our way through some of that. But the good news is that as you work through the book, you're spending some time looking at some of these really important issues, but eventually moving through trauma then trying to avoid being re-traumatized, because that's a big issue, and in even life afterwards, because I was hoping that even in the short time we have with you, we might be able to give people a sense of hope, and also to let them know that there are resources out there that they can tap into. So first of all, as we go to a break, let me just mention that if you would like to learn a little bit more, the first particular link we have is to Lisa Saruga, and you can simply go to that website. Don't even have to know how to spell her last name, because we already have the link on the website there, where it says healing is possible even when the world offers no happy endings. And there are all sorts of great pieces of information there which you can begin to address and find out about the book. Then, of course, we have a link to her social media. And then finally, of course, this book, now that it has come out this year, is probably in your local bookstore. But if they don't have a copy of this book that is published by Kerby'll, we have a link to getting it both in paperback and Kindle. And all of that is available at our website, pointofview.net. Let's come back and talk about coping, and then eventually working our way through trauma. All that coming up right after this.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Continue our conversation with Lisa Saruga for a few more minutes. The book is entitled The Trauma Tree, Going Beyond Survival, Growing Through Wholeness. Shares her own journey of healing, as well as the book is just filled with practical steps for addressing some of these mental health challenges, biblically based techniques, therapeutic approaches, and all the rest to really deal with the hopelessness and loss and grief that sometimes an individual, perhaps you, have dealt with in terms of your trauma. So if you have had a trauma, this book is certainly one I would recommend. If you know somebody who maybe has been through a trauma, you might want to take this interview and pass it on to them or even tell them about the book. But part of the issue, I would have to say, Lisa, is to deal with these coping mechanisms. Sometimes we don't want to look at the trauma, so we want to maybe medicate ourselves, drug ourselves, maybe compartmentalize the issue. And when we don't look at it face to face, it's going to eventually surface again, even as it did in your own life.
Right. I think that it's important to recognize that, again, trauma lives in this amygdala, this part of our brain that kind of holds on to that forever. And so when we use artificial coping, which really is not coping, it's putting off dealing with the trauma, it's not successful. And in the long run, that the symptoms of post-traumatic stress can really become complicated. So some of the artificial coping that I talk about is, as you said, using substances to avoid feeling, denial or compartmentalization, where you just kind of set it aside and pretend like it's almost like something you watched on TV. It didn't really happen. Or even looking for unhealthy relationships that distract us from the trauma. Those are all things that are not helpful, because the truth is, once we've experienced trauma, we don't just get over it. We have to walk through it. And part of walking through it is going to be feeling those feels, as unpleasant as they are. But there is a way through, and there is healing on the other side.
One of the things I took away from your book, and there are lots of myths about trauma that we need to address, but one of those is there's no one-size-fits-all. Everyone's healing journey is unique. Everybody's personality is different. Everyone's particular trauma may be different. So to assume that you've seen someone else deal with their particular trauma and you should deal with it in the same way, I think is fallacious, isn't it?
Oh yeah. There's a lot of things that we say to try to comfort people that they're kind of cliche comforts. And one of them is you just need to get over it, right? And again, we don't just get over it. There's work and there's time that has to pass. Not just time, there's work that goes into actually healing and getting beyond trauma.
What about this issue of guilt and shame? It seems to me that shows up so often in any kind of abuse. And so whether it's trauma or just abuse in the broader sense, you have a section about that. And it is amazing to me that sometimes people will feel guilty for something they never did wrong. I mean, whether it's childhood sexual abuse or whether it was an assault or an attack or rape or whatever it might be. But that does surface, and that's one of those many emotions you have to deal with, right?
Right. And there's a difference between guilt and shame. So I want to start there. Guilt is something that we feel when we've done something wrong, right? Guilt is associated with wrongdoing. And so if we've done something wrong, there's usually a way we can make amends or apologize or fix whatever it is that we've done wrong. Shame is not the feeling that I've done something wrong. It's that feeling that there's something wrong with me. And so a lot of times when I hear people talking about feeling guilt after trauma, it's really shame. They're feeling like there's something wrong with them, that they weren't able to avoid the trauma in the first place. And I think others kind of feed into that. I think about Job. Job experienced trauma on trauma. And his friends who came to comfort him, they did exactly the right thing the first few days. They sat with him and said nothing. They just were there. They were his support system. But I think as they sat, they had time to think about, okay, why did this happen to Job, and how do I know it's not going to happen to me? And then we started assigning guilt. Like, okay, Job, what did you do wrong to cause this? Because I don't want to do the same thing.
Yes.
And so I think inadvertently there are comments that lead us to feel guilt and shame. And it's not a healthy coping mechanism.
And I think it might be good at this point to also mention that one of the benefits of this book, and this is why I would encourage pastors and Sunday school leaders and others to get a copy of the book, because you will find yourself in a position of support. Even if you've never been through a trauma, if you have any significant number of people in your life, in your church, in your small group, your life group, whatever it might be, somebody has been through that, and it's what you need to know how to listen, how to comfort, how to walk alongside them. And so in some respects, even though this book primarily is its target audience or for people that have been through trauma, I think you would agree, Lisa, that this is a book you want to hand to other individuals who are in the helping professions so that they know what to say and do, so they don't end up being like Job's miserable comforters.
Right. I am so glad that you said that, because I highly encourage pastors to read this. There's one denomination who is thinking about giving this book to everybody who is a candidate for ordination. And the reason for that is, if you look at just sexual assault, that was one of them that you mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
About 1 in 6 women have experienced that.
Yes.
So if you've got a church that has more than 6 women in it, you probably have somebody in your church who has experienced that. There is not a church out there that has nobody who's ever experienced trauma. And yet it's a difficult topic that sometimes just kind of gets shelved in churches. And so this is a way to just really dive deep to avoid re-traumatizing people inadvertently by just saying the wrong thing without even knowing maybe they've experienced trauma. This is going to be a really good resource for how to manage a trauma-informed church.
Might just mention that if you go to your website, and again, it's lisasaruga.com. First of all, you can find out about the book, but also Writing Raw, because one of the sections you had there is you encourage your clients to write raw, and R stands for raw writing, mm-hmm. A for asserting the themes, and W, words from God. And so some people might say, well, that would be something else that would be helpful in addition to the book, and you have a free download in that regard. So as people go to the website, let's talk about that, because you can sign up for your newsletter. You can get some free downloads. You can, of course, find out about the book and all sorts of other resources. And if they had a question or wanted to chat with you, that's all available on your website, isn't it?
It is, yes. I'm glad that you said that. I do hope that people will reach out and chat with me. Journaling is something that we hear a lot about. It can be very therapeutic, but it can also go south if we don't do it well. So there are a lot of people who journal and they just write down all the negative, and they kind of spiral into this negative cycle of writing. And that can be really detrimental. And so raw writing allows God a chance to speak back into our situation. So we start out by writing raw, and if that's negative, that's negative. Write exactly what you're thinking and feeling and experiencing. But then we want to reflect back and look at the themes and what we've written, and then give God a chance to speak through his word.
Very good.
And so we would look at those themes and maybe the theme is justice. And so I Google scriptures on justice, and I just write 1 or 2 scripture verses from God that addresses that topic. And it's surprising, because over time you really develop this dialogue with God that can be very comforting and helpful.
Again, this is all part of the book, The Trauma Tree. And if you'd like to know more about some of those issues, we have that on our website. We have a link to her website. And so take the time to get a copy of the book, to contact her. And we'll take a break and come back with more right after this.
In 1972, Point of View was founded to address 3 needs in America. First, to create a trustworthy source of information without the liberal bias pervasive in the mainstream media. Second, to cover issues that real Americans needed to know about, issues impacting faith, family, and freedom. Finally, and most importantly, Point of View was founded to examine each issue from a Christian perspective, anchoring Americans to biblical truth once more. Thanks to support from people like you, Point of View has successfully carried out this mission for 53 years. But if we want to carry the mission forward into the future, we need your help today. This is a critical time of year. Point of View depends on listeners like you to donate generously. Forge ahead into the future with us. Give today at pointofview.net or call 800-347-5151. Pointofview.net and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
Going through the stations and caught Kerby and a very interesting topic. So just listening to it, and so just by hearing the topic, I can relate to some of those topics. But it has impacted my life a lot. I enjoy listening to the station.
I appreciate Point of View. You've been great and wonderful. A lot of information, and I really appreciate all your work you do.
My wife and I have listened to Point of View for about 17 years now. We just want you to know how much you have meant to us in our lives. I've gotten a real education since I've started listening to Point of View.
I want you to think, what would we do? How ignorant would we be if we didn't have Point of View? And come on, guys, give something to Point of View to make sure we don't lose this wonderful voice. And thanks again for what you do.
Thank you, Kerby. I consider this my school time, so my 2 hours of school each day. So thank you very much.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Second hour today, we're going to spend some time in the first half hour here talking about how to maybe get a 10,000-mile tune-up on your car, as well as some other things. Of course, we're talking about your marriage, but again, just as we oftentimes want to get some kind of tune-up in our car, maybe a wheel alignment, we need that in our marriages, especially in the second half of life, because oftentimes in the middle and later decades of life, we sometimes face some very significant and unusual situations, and that's why I'm very excited about this book, which is entitled A Seasoned Marriage, Living the Gospel, Middle Years and Beyond, forward by our good friend Bob Lepine, and you might remember him, of course, from all the different radio that we've talked about with him over the years because of his involvement as the host of Family Life Today, also the teaching pastor at Redeemer Community Church there in Little Rock, Arkansas. The author of this book is Larry McCall. Dr. Larry McCall has his doctorate ministry. He is the director of the Walking Like Jesus Ministries. We have a link to that, and it's wljministries.org. You don't have to remember all that because it's on our website here. He has served as the lead pastor at Christ Covenant Church there in Winona Lake, Indiana for over 30 years. Is a graduate right there of Grace College and Grace Theological Seminary. He has his Doctor of Ministry degree from Trinity Evangelical Divinity School. Certainly, one of the things that we are going to be talking about is marriage, and so I think we would begin by saying congratulations to you, Larry, celebrating 50 years of marriage to your high school sweetheart. So thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Thanks, Kerby. Yeah, next week is 50 years, and the more you get to know me, the more you respect my wife.
Well, I've just had a 50 anniversary as well last year, and we celebrated that, so
congrats.
Just 1 year ahead of you. And again, we do have a link to Walking Like Jesus Ministries, helping people reflect Christ in everyday life. So there are all sorts of different aspects of that. Might just mention some of your other books in the past certainly have talked about walking like Jesus did, loving your wife as Christ loves the church, grandparenting with grace, a seasoned marriage is the one we're talking about today. So if people say, well, I'd like to see some of the other books that you have produced, that is certainly available as well. This one published by New Growth Press, and it has about 100, almost 200 pages in there. And so again, let's see if we can talk about the reason for that. And that has to do with the fact that when you were first married, you had very significant challenges getting two families to come together for the first time, dealing with some of the financial issues, dealing with some of the structural issues. But now we're talking about the fact that in the latter parts, you have adult children, talking about how to relate to adult children. We're talking about grandchildren. So in some respects, this is the kind of book really intended for people that have been married for a while.
Yes, it is, Kerby. You know, it's fascinating that most books on marriage are written for people getting married, planning to get married, or in their early years. But very few books have been written for people who are at the midpoint of life and beyond. And so try to ascertain what are some of those challenges and changes that come in that season of life. And how does the gospel come and shape that and sweeten that? So we hope this book serves a lot of couples.
Let's see if we can maybe take your two chapters together, because you talk about reflecting and evaluating. Reflecting, of course, why did you get married in the first place? Evaluating, responding to the changes you're now facing. You're older, maybe a little wiser, maybe moving a little slower, maybe having some areas that we talked about before about trauma, but also some areas of success. So in some respects, a lot of what you are encouraging people to do in the 13 chapters is in those first two to really kind of reevaluate where you came from and then again where you're going.
That's right. Yes, I think when you think back to why we got married in the first place, I can't speak for everybody, Kerby, but I think if we were to be candid, most of us would say, I got married for me. This person I married her, married him to make me happy. And that was kind of a self-centered view of getting married. But that's the unspoken reason most people get married. But then realizing that God has a higher calling for us. He wants us as a married couple to be like a living reenactment of the greatest love story ever, the love that Christ has for his bride. And that comes right out of Ephesians 5. So I think once couples see that, it gives kind of new direction, new impetus in their marriages, whether they're newlyweds or whether they have celebrated their golden wedding anniversary.
Yeah. And again, you may have gotten married for the wrong reasons, but you're married now, and you need to have the right reasons to go forward. And so reflecting and evaluating. The next one I thought we would talk about is releasing, because I've been alluding to the fact that not all marriages have children, but most do. And by the time you've been married for a while, you're now launching your kids into adult life. And in some respects, you're involved in a process of putting yourself out of business, because ultimately they then run their own lives and raise their own families. And sometimes that whole transition of releasing and transitioning, very significant challenges as well, aren't they?
Yes, they are. And sometimes it's traumatic on the marriage. And so that's why we wanted to address that issue in this book, was not only the joys and the grief of releasing our kids, but how does that impact our marriages? When our last one got married years ago, my wife said, and this is the tone of her voice, she said, "Oh, Larry, now it's just us." And I said, no, Glennie, now it's just us. It's all in the inflection, Kerby.
Yes. But again, that is part of that issue, because if you were married and had children right away, and I know of individuals that have told me that they had their first child almost exactly 9 months after their wedding vows, which tells you a lot about a lot of things. They never really have had much time by themselves. And all of a sudden, one day, all those kids running all over the house are gone, or they start beginning to disappear. And in a sense, that brings you back to, okay, what got us married in the first place? Back to the reflecting chapter there as well. And so that whole issue of releasing and transitioning is not a small issue at all. That's why I think almost a third of your book gets into those first 4 chapters, because I think they really have to do with all the kinds of changes that happen in the second half of marriage.
Yeah, that's right, Kerby. Yeah, and I think for a lot of couples, like you said, if they have children early on, they might have spent 20, 25, even 30 years just focusing on their kids. And then the last one leaves the nest, and they look at each other, and the question that's in the back of their minds is, now who is this person I'm married to?
Yeah, who are you?
And they haven't really nurtured the marriage that significantly. So rather than just saying, oh, well, that's the way it is, and coasting to the finish line, now's a good opportunity to say, Lord, help us to restore the joy of our early years. Help us, Lord, to go farther in our marriage than we did in our earlier years, that we might be that bright reflection of Christ and his bride. So it's an opportunity to pick up speed, or even chart a new direction that gives honor and glory to God and joy to our spouse.
Let's take a break. When we come back, we have a lot more to cover. We've only talked about 4 of the chapters, but quite a number of others that are very significant. All part of a book called A Seasoned Marriage. If you'd like to know more about Larry McCall, about his ministry, or about the books, all available on our website, pointofview.net.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
For decades, we have heard that the U.S. needs to be more like Europe. But as I've documented in previous commentaries, if we were more like Europe, we would have less liberal abortion policies and fewer transgender surgeries. We can learn some lessons from European countries like Denmark. The Danish government just raised its retirement age to 70 for Danes born in 1971 or later. This was due to a reform passed years ago that ties the retirement age to average life expectancy at age 60. This factors in the reality that people are living longer than when government retirement programs were first instituted. More than 30 years ago, I wrote the book Signs of Warning, Signs of Hope. One of the chapters on the crisis of security documented increasing life expectancy at birth and the increasing percentage of people living over the age of 65. It was inevitable that the U.S. Social Security system would run out of money in the future. A recent Wall Street Journal editorial predicts Social Security will be insolvent in 2033 and predicts the checks will suddenly be 21% smaller. America's politicians won't follow Denmark's lead for three reasons. First, later retirement would not be welcomed by people who work in physically demanding professions. I've been a janitor and have dug ditches and worked in a machine shop. I can't imagine how hard it would be to make it to age 70 to retire. Second, no politician wants to touch the third rail of American politics. Third, there's an easier answer: print more dollars. My previous commentaries on the book The Big Print reminds us that politicians will always take the easy way out, even if it means lots of inflation. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free booklet on biblical reliability, go to viewpoints.info/biblical reliability. Viewpoints.info/biblical reliability. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, and we are talking with Larry McCall. Again, the book is entitled A Seasoned Marriage, and we certainly encourage you to find out more about that. But Larry, let's, if we can, get into another issue, and that is resisting, fighting the tendency towards marital monotony. It does seem to me that, like you said, if I've spent all my time and energy raising my kids, I'm not really thinking about what the future is going to be, and all of a sudden we're just kind of on autopilot. We're just kind of getting boring as individuals, and that's the time to really begin to refocus what you're going to do in the second half of your marriage.
Yes. Yeah, you know, Kerby, I think a lot of people get to that point in life where maybe the kids have left home and marriage is just kind of boring, and they just think, well, that's the way it is at this season of life. I guess we just need to accept it. And what happens is you get two individuals still married but living independent lives.
And so, again, one of the things that you're going to have to do is figure out, well, how did we drift apart? What can we do to maybe bring some of that excitement that was in our marriage years ago back into it? Those are all, I think, really important issues to address. And that now gets us into some of the others. I remember years ago when I was writing about some of the future trends that I was seeing, even at the time in the 1990s. In one of my books, I documented that it was quite possible that for a baby boom wife, she might spend more years taking care of her aged parents than she did taking care of her children. And so you have a chapter there on the challenges of aging parents because we are living longer. Matter of fact, my commentary today is about how at least one country, Denmark, has raised the retirement age just to recognize that people are living a lot longer than they were before. That is, I think, another almost unexpected stress that many people have in the second half of marriage.
Yeah, Kerby, and I really wanted to include teaching on this because it's an issue a lot of couples deal with, like you just said, with longer lives, but it does impact marriage. And, you know, let's be candid, the majority, I think it's about 75% of the caregivers of the elderly are women. And so a lot of men, their wives are taking care of their parents, the husband's parents or parent. And, you know, a lot of times I think men, I'm going to be hard on us men, Kerby. I think a lot of times we men think, well, that's a woman's strength, and I'll just, you know, not cause problems. I'll just be kind of quiet here. But I think for the marriage to be strong, the husband and the wife need to see themselves as a ministry team to that elderly parent who needs help. And maybe they have different gifts, and that's great by God's design. But what can each of them do to work as a team in reflecting the grace of Christ to that elderly parent? And it can actually be a bonding thing. My wife and I helped care for her mother in her latter months. She went to be with the Lord 3 years ago. But you know what? It was a bonding time, and my love for my mother-in-law just grew too out of it all, by the way.
Yes. And sometimes those relationships aren't so good, so they're even more stress-producing and the rest. And, of course, as you say, walking your parent to heaven's gate, because eventually that is the ultimate issue as well. Just as you, if you will, put yourself out of a job of raising your kids, in a sense, you eventually possibly will put yourself out of a job of raising your elderly parents. And so there are all sorts of other emotional stresses and things that are certainly associated with that as well. Well, let's talk about the other end of life, because not only are you taking care of your aged parents, possibly, you're also wanting to become intentional in trying to raise your other kids. These would be your grandchildren. And so you call that investing. And it is interesting to me that some of the surveys that we've even done at Pro Ministries talking about the profound opportunity that grandparents have to actually cultivate and even encourage the spiritual nature of their grandchildren. That, I think, is so important. And again, I appreciate the fact that you put a chapter in there about that issue.
Yes. You know, I think almost every grandparent loves being a grandparent. And, you know, you ask why, and they say, well, it's just so much fun to spoil the grandkids and send them home. Well, that's not God's calling on us as grandparents.
Not yet.
That doesn't do anybody any favors. But, you know, I think, Kerby, like Psalm 78 says, one generation shall tell another generation about the glorious deeds of God. And then down in verse 7, it says, so that they would set their hope in God. And that should be our mission, our goal, our prayerful goal as grandparents is, Lord, let me show the grandkids your glory, your grace in such a way that they lean in and say, Papa, Grandma, tell me more. That we want our grandkids to see the glory of Christ and to want him as their Savior. And so as grandparents to be intentional, have lots of fun with grandkids. We have 7 grandkids, love every one of them. I'm going to be with a couple of them here in another hour. But, you know, to not just have fun, but to have fun in the context of passing on the stories of God's greatness and grace. It's such a privilege.
Yeah. And one part of that is finishing strong. Chapter 8, refocusing, exploring purposeful retirement. Chapter 9, serving, finding ways to serve together in our seasoned years. There is a tendency sometimes, Larry, for people to say, well, after the age of 65, I'm done. You know, don't need to serve in the church anymore. Don't really need to think about this. You know, I'm going to spend my grandkids or my kids' inheritance, all the lines they've heard before. And yet this is where, as a Christian, we should be thinking about how to apply the wisdom, the gifts, and the opportunities, maybe even now the time that we can really devote to that and to make it purposeful.
Yeah, I think a lot of older folks getting to retirement age, Kerby, think I've done my time, I paid my dues, now it's me time.
Yes.
And they look at those so-called golden years as I get to do what I want to do. And it is nice to have that flexibility. But we're still on mission. And I remember hearing an old recording of someone. Oh, it was Howard Hendricks. You're in Dallas, aren't you?
Oh, sure.
Yeah, well, Howard Hendricks there from Dallas years ago. I heard him teaching on this subject, and he said, ask yourself the question, what am I retiring to?
Yes.
And I thought that is a simple but profound question. And so even if we're leaving our jobs of employment, we still can stay involved in pouring into other people, whether it's our own family, people in our church, our community, that we can live purposeful lives. And even when our physical abilities decline to the point that we can't get out and about, there's still the ministry of prayer. So life is always on mission until the Lord calls us home.
Might just mention that you have a whole section there on Finishing Well. Of course, we've even had Finishing Well Ministries here, Hal Hallbecker. But just before we run out of time, I wanted to not only talk about what is in your book, but the way in which people can connect up with you. And so we have a link to Walking Like Jesus Ministries, and that is helping people reflect Christ in everyday life. Of course, I've mentioned just one of many of the books that you've written and all the great resources there. So let's, if we can, for just a minute, talk about the fact that if people would like to know more about how to apply some of these principles and to learn from books like Walking Like Jesus and also Loving Your Wife as Christ Loves the Church, or this one, A Seasoned Marriage, they can go to that website. And as they do so, isn't there a way in which they can connect up with you and get your newsletter?
Yes, there's a contact button on the website that they can sign up to stay in tune with what we're doing here. Glad to hear from people that way. And you can order books through the website, but it's a lot easier to maybe get them through Amazon or other book distributors or directly from the publisher.
And we do have that link. I might just mention you have a blog and all sorts of other resources. But again, just before we run out of time, let me just mention that this is a book that you can work through. But again, one of the things I love about your book is that you have at the end of each one of these chapters a series of questions, oftentimes about 4 questions. And so this is where a small group could actually lead through a group of marriage individuals, maybe those who are in the last half of marriage and are really thinking about this. This is a resource that has 13 chapters. You could have a chapter a week. It would fit very well into a quarter. You could take some of this great material and all sorts of great individuals that we know, including, of course, our good friend Bob Lepine, who have endorsed the book. So, A Seasoned Marriage by Larry McCall. And Larry, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Thanks for having me, Kerby.
One more time, let me just encourage you to go to the website, Walking Like Jesus Ministries. You may not be familiar with that one, and it's wljministries.org. You're going to find a blog there. You're going to find all sorts of things where you can watch some of the videos. You can find out about some of the other books, because I would commend those to you as well. But if you find yourself in kind of the last half of marriage, as I've been referring to it, this is a book that is pretty unique, and that's why we wanted you to know about it today here on Point of View. We come back, we've got a lot to cover, and we'll do our best to get as much in the last half hour as we can. We'll be right back.
It was not that long ago that censorship appeared to be almost inevitable. Free speech was being attacked and strangled in many places, and some of us wondered if this was the end. But now, many feel a new sense of hope, a chance for a fresh dawn. Let me caution you, now is not the time to relax. It's a time to press forward, to use this fresh opportunity to proclaim and learn how to apply truth to current issues. By the fact you're here, listening right now, that tells me that you recognize the vital role Point of View plays as a voice of truth. For more than 50 years, we've informed and equipped people who have made a real difference. And when you give to Point of View today, you breathe life into what can be a new golden era for the truth. Please, take a moment right now and invest in truth. Visit pointofview.net or give it 1-800-347-5151. That's pointofview.net. Click in now or call 1-800-347-5151.
Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Final half hour. If you'd like to join the conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Going to step back for just a few minutes, though, and look at some issues of religious liberty. And again, I'm not a lawyer. I don't play a lawyer on television. But again, one of my graduate degrees is from Georgetown in Government in American Political Theory, and have studied the Constitution probably as much as some lawyers have, even sometimes more, because we've gotten into things like the Federalist Papers and a variety of others. So I do do want to talk about a very important Supreme Court decision and what that says about where we are moving in terms of some of these court decisions. And that certainly will be something we'll pick up again on Friday when we do have some lawyers in here, and that will be Kelly Shackelford and Jeff Mateer. But just before we do so, you might notice, as I mentioned yesterday, that I sent out an email which had the title Anchored to Truth. Of course, that's kind of our theme. And the subject line was New Generation, Same Mission. And we talked about yesterday about the three needs that we were wanting to address back when Marlon Maddox started the program in 1972. I was well aware of the program during the 1970s and then actually started being a guest on the program in the early 1980s. And by 1986, actually was a co-host. And it's hard to believe that that's, 39 years ago. So that's a few years away. But nevertheless, the goal at the time was to provide a source of information without the kind of bias that some of us were experiencing in the 1970s. I know Marlon and I both were very concerned about this liberal talk show host in Dallas. I was on that talk show a couple of times and got beat up pretty good. But that's why he was just saying, we're not getting answers from the people in the mainstream media. We're not getting fair answers sometimes, even from the local talk shows. So maybe I should do something, and that's where the program started. Then also to provide a source of information for all sorts of particular issues that would really never be covered by mainstream media. A lot of these we'll talk about in just a minute in terms of religious liberty. And finally, to, of course, develop a Christian perspective and help restore a biblical worldview. And so in the email, I always point out that we've been a proven and consistent and trustworthy voice, and also have really equipped you. And if you go to the website right now, you'll notice something, and that is if you click on the banner that says Anchored to Truth, we're really encouraging you to give to this ministry, and you'll notice something else. A $50,000, actually it's now $51,000 matching challenge, which is on the table. Which means some of you say, well, I do want to give to Point of View, but I'd like to have a dollar-for-dollar match. And we're up to $51,000. I think we're going to get off to $100,000. Still working on that. But if you say, I really appreciate what you're doing. I appreciate the fact today you've talked about trauma. You've talked about seasoned marriage. You've really talked about some of the issues of the riots taking place. Now we're going to get into the issue of religious liberty. We talked about the Medicaid myth. We talked about vaccine advisory group changing. And if you say, well, I've learned a lot of things, even today on Point of View, that I would not have known if I hadn't tuned into the program, maybe that would be a reason for you to click on that button that says Give Now. And when you give now, you will see the fact that we do have that challenge on the table there. That is a matching challenge. And a lot of people say, well, I'd really like to give, but I'd love to know that my dollar goes even further. And so there's a button there for ongoing giving. You certainly, I would encourage some of you to think about giving monthly, because as I point out, of course, we send out our monthly Outlook magazine, which I'm holding up right now. This one just on the issue of foreign policy. Of course, we also have the booklets, which I can hold up as well. Or even if you would like to make a single gift, that is an opportunity for you to give right now and to have it matched. So I wanted you to know that that is now implemented, and between now and June 30th, that Monday, is an opportunity for you to have that dollar-for-dollar match, unless we use it up. And then you don't want to be the last person who says, oh, well, if I'd known it was going to run out, I would have given days ago. So don't always wait to the last moment to give. It's easier on you. It's easier on us. And that is certainly the case. So go to the website, Anchored to Truth. Of course, you can also respond to the email. I printed mine out here. I'm showing you, and it took about 2.5 pages. And there's a place for you to give there as well. So you're on to respond in any way that you would like to do so. Let's, if we can, get into what I think is a very significant Supreme Court decision. And it has to do with the fact that the Supreme Court ruled 9-0, another one of these unanimous cases. Now, you might remember if you were listening on Friday, we had Erin Smith here, and I asked her at the time, as a lawyer that works with First Liberty, the significance of unanimous. And she says, well, the advantage is that if it's not a 5-4 decision or even a 6-3 decision where somebody can come back and say, well, maybe you've rethought that. This was unanimous. As a matter of fact, this one makes me smile a little bit. The person that wrote the opinion was Justice Sonia Sotomayor. Okay, we can have a debate as to who the most liberal justice on the Supreme Court is. Elena Kagan, Sonia Sotomayor, I don't know, we can all guess, but I'd say that probably she could be considered the most liberal. And the fact that she wrote the unanimous decision is significant because what she essentially is doing is, in a gracious sort of way, slapping the face of the individuals that were in the Wisconsin Supreme Court who ruled 4-3 against Catholic charities. Let me explain this for just a minute. The state of Wisconsin ruled 4-3. These are 4 very liberal justices who I guess would be considered to be more liberal and even more secular than Sonia Sotomayor, if there's any room on the left of her, that said that the Catholic Charities local diocese was not eligible for a religious tax exemption because what they were doing was, quote, secular in nature. And so as a result, because they weren't teaching the faith or supplying religious materials, they no longer qualified for having a religious tax exemption. Now, what you got to understand here is they were doing exactly what Catholic charities have been doing for a long time. But let me just come to Sonia Sotomayor. It's going to be rare that you hear me quoting from one of the most liberal justices on the Supreme Court favorably, but I am, in which he writes in her opinion that if the state law treats 2 religious soup kitchens differently, depending on the amount of prayer and proselytizing they do before lunch, that by its definition is a violation of the First Amendment. 3 cheers to Sonia Sotomayor, Justice Sotomayor. Here's part of her ruling. She says, quote, "It's fundamental to our Constitution and our constitutional order that the government maintains neutrality between religion and religion. There may be hard calls to make in policing that rule, but this is not one of them." I just love this. And again, the bottom line is that the 4 liberal Wisconsin judges can't say they weren't warned. This piece here by the editorial board of the Wall Street Journal said, because you have the conservatives, the other 3 on the court, that wrote this. The majority's activism renders the exemption unconstitutional. The ruling looks through a seemingly Protestant lens to deem works of charity worthy of exception only if accompanied by proselytizing, a combination forbidden by Catholicism, Judaism, and many other religions. And, of course, part of that has to do with this sort of inherent bias against Catholics. It goes all the way back to the Blaine Amendment and others. And that is, if you go down the street from right here, I'm very well aware of this homeless charity that's not far from where this broadcast is, in which they always have prayer before they have the lunch and everything. There's soup kitchens where sometimes they'll have a message. If you go to Fort Worth, I'm very well aware of the fact that oftentimes they'll have a gospel message before they serve in the soup kitchen. But if Catholics don't, it doesn't mean that somehow it's secular. It means that it's doing what Catholic charities have been doing for some time. And you can begin to see how there has been this attempt to say, well, when you do things that we consider to be Catholic or Protestant or Jewish or even Muslim, then that's religious. But when you try to house the homeless, when you try to feed the homeless, when you try to feed the downtrodden, well, that's really more like a government function, and that's not really religious. Of course, you and I both know that is a fallacious argument. And 3 cheers for 9 justices of the Supreme Court to essentially say the 4 liberal judges in Wisconsin got it wrong. I posted that for you to read because I think it's an interesting and a very important decision that came down from the Supreme Court. We'll be right back.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes while we're talking about religious liberty. I thought I'd take on one other case. This one comes from Alliance Defending Freedom. I guess we need to get Lathan Watts back in the studio once again. His line the other day got everybody laughing. You might remember when we had him on with Robert Knight, and he was pointing out the fact that every time we turn around, we've got a case out of Colorado. Of course, the classic one is Jack Phillips, the baker, who on a number of different occasions was sued because he said, look, I just can't in good conscience. I'll give you the cake, but I'm not going to decorate it to celebrate first a same-sex union, later a same-sex marriage, then one for a coming out of transitioning from male to female, whatever it was. And so, I mean, this poor man has been pilloried time and time again by first the Colorado government and then had to take cases to the Supreme Court, won every time, but in many cases, the Supreme Court, in some respects, just remanded them back to Colorado, and he's just never really had this cloud over his head. And if that's not bad enough, another case out of Colorado, of course, was the woman who says, you know, I do these web cases, and I actually designed webs, but I was concerned that sooner or later somebody was going to want me to design a web page for their wedding. And if it was for a same-sex wedding, I would not feel comfortable about doing that. So that case went to the Supreme Court as well. He, of course, the other day talked about another case coming out of a particular Colorado camp. And there are quite a number of Christian camps in Colorado, if you're not familiar. And that one is one that they're going to adjudicate as well. And he said, it seems like every time we turn around, there's another case coming out of Colorado, because there was a fourth one I forget about. He says, we just ought to have like an express lane between Colorado and the Supreme Court because of all of the abuse of religious liberty in the state of Colorado. Well, it's not just in Colorado. Here's an interesting one out of a particular state you wouldn't have guessed, Virginia. And it turns out that Alliance Defending Freedom has now filed a complaint in the state of Virginia on behalf of 3 students at Liberty University. As you may know, Liberty University, largest university in the country, Christian university, in terms of both post people there and online, although I guess Grand Canyon College could be in that same category, but certainly one of the largest. I'll leave it at that. And the issue is this. A policy that exists in the state of Virginia, which amazes me, says that we will provide tuition grants to any student in any program unless, are you ready for this? Unless the student is actually involved in religious training or theological education. Oh, here we go again. This one reminds me of a case we'll talk about on Friday, no doubt, with Kelly Shackelford and Jeff Mateer out of the state of Maine, in which it said, well, we will provide funds for any charter school unless the charter school is religious. And this, of course, is a case that we'll maybe get to talk about tomorrow and even on Friday, because this case is, if nothing else, according to Raleigh Adams, a case which would really raise a red flag, not just for those of us that are Christians, but for anybody that appreciates open inquiry, because you would say, well, we would want to protect the free exercise of religion of any individual, and here protecting freedom of thought, saying, well, if you're going to study, say, psychology, well, that gets your tuition grant. But if you're going to study psychology that relates to helping Christians, well, that doesn't count. And you can begin to see the fallacy of the argument. And we also see that when the university denies funding to a student group because its leaders are religious, or when a state bars students from receiving aid for choosing a theological major, then again, what are the protections of religious liberty and freedom of conscience? And this goes back to some previous cases, going all the way back to the University of California at Berkeley, going back to some other cases involving such things as InterVarsity Christian Fellowship, even the Christian Legal Society, because on some campuses they lost official recognition simply because the school said you cannot require in a religious organization individuals who are leaders to actually agree with the religious views of the organization, which just made no sense. I mean, imagine if you had a vegan society and you had somebody that wanted to be the head who's a meat eater. Well, I mean, come on, you wouldn't let that happen. And you wouldn't certainly say that if this was a Jewish group that you would allow a Muslim to be the leader of the Muslim group. I mean, you understand that. And so, nevertheless, this is where we are in terms of some of that. So, again, what she is arguing is this might be a place not only for Alliance Defending Freedom, but for Christians on campus. And I really want to start maybe talking to the Charlie Kirks of the world and others, saying maybe we can put together a coalition of both religious students and non-religious students who are committed to defending freedom of conscience on campus. I think that would really be something else that could be done. But nevertheless, it's another article. I'll post it for tomorrow. We'll get back to it a little bit because it's just, I think, a good illustration of the fact that we are winning so many of these cases on religious liberty. And even the one case we did not win this last time, which was a 4-4 split, simply because Amy Coney Barrett had to recuse herself. Even that one, I think, is going to come back and win. And so, if nothing else, we're seeing a lot of common sense breaking out, and we're seeing the possibility of bringing a few more of these cases to even extend the opportunity for religious liberty. And that's really good news. So we'll be talking about that, no doubt, with Kelly Shackelford and Jeff Mateer. We'll see if we can get Lathan Watts back again. They've got another case coming out right now with Alliance Defending Freedom, and we'll see how that comes down. But I predict that one is going to be a victory as well. And as I like to say to him every once in a while, you getting tired of winning? He said, no, we're not getting tired of winning at all. And that's good news. And again, you probably only are hearing that in places like Point of View. Just before I go, let me mention a few things. My Viewpoints commentary is about, again, that the country of Denmark has raised its retirement age to 70 based upon a requirement that came from reform passed years ago, saying anybody born in 1971 or later, raising the requirement for retirement older, because we recognize people are living longer than when government programs were first instituted. And as we've said before, we are always being told that we need to make America more like Europe. And if we did, guess what? We'd have less liberal abortion laws. We'd have fewer transgender surgeries. We might have older retirement ages. Don't think that's going to happen, but it's one of those pieces that I wanted you to read today and pass on to others. We have, of course, our Take Action item on parental rights if you haven't already acted on that. And let me now, since I did talk about the fact that we have a banner up, Anchored to Truth, click on that button that says Give Now, and you will see that we have a matching challenge already on the table. It's increasing. It says there 50,000. I think we're up to 51,000, and we're going to get to, I think, 100,000 before we're all done. And that's good news. So it's a dollar for dollar match. If you said, I appreciate what you're doing today, I'd like to give, well, then just scroll down, and you'll find a section there where you can give monthly or a single gift, and that would be matched. And I would encourage you to take action even as we're going off the air. First of all, as we're going off the air, as always, I'd like to thank Megan for help engineering the program. Steve, thank you for producing the program. Look forward to seeing you tomorrow right here on Point of View.
In 1972, Point of View was founded to address three needs in America. First, to create a trustworthy source of information without the liberal bias pervasive in the mainstream media. Second, to cover issues that real Americans needed to know about, issues impacting faith, family, and freedom. Finally, and most importantly, Point of View was founded to examine each issue from a Christian perspective, anchoring Americans to biblical truth once more. Thanks to support from people like you, Point of View has successfully carried out this mission for 53 years. But if we want to carry the mission forward into the future, we need your help today. This is a critical time of year. Point of View depends on listeners like you to donate generously. Forge ahead into the future with us. Give today at pointofview.net or call 800-347-5151. Pointofview.net and 800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.